Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a really hard look at a name that has lived in infamy for over a century, H. Holmes. Now, he's often dubbed America's first serial killer, and the stories you hear about him, they are literally the stuff of nightmares. But in This Explainer, we're going to entirely dismantle that bloody mythology. Because as we'll see when we actually look at the facts, the man behind these terrifying legends was less of an evil mastermind and far, far more of a ruthless, greedy con artist.
So let's dive right into the core question that's going to guide our whole analysis today. We really need to ask ourselves if the infamous White City Devil was truly the grand architect of a terrifying torture labyrinth during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, or was he just a desperate scammer who expertly spun his own gruesome mythology to hide a much more pathetic reality?
Consider this staggering number, 200. This is the figure that has been passed down for generations by novelists, journalists, and even history buffs. Sensational legend states he killed upwards of 200 people, trapping unsuspecting tourists who were just visiting the Chicago World's Fair. It's a genuinely terrifying thought. But as we dig into the source material, this number starts to look incredibly suspicious. The massive gap between the story and the truth is honestly astounding. I mean, the legend insists on a murder castle completely furnished with trapdoors, secret staircases, and a basement crematorium. But historical evidence? It shows this building was just an unfinished, mixed-use retail space. And his actual victim count was not hundreds of strangers, but likely around 9 people. And here's the kicker. They were all business associates or romantic partners he already knew. The whole murder castle idea was completely fabricated to serve as a distraction from his mundane, grim reality. Section 1. A very creepy childhood.
Holmes was his own wildly unreliable narrator. He actually boasted that he was, quote, well-trained by loving and religious parents. He desperately wanted the world to believe he was perfectly nurtured, kind of suggesting that any later wrongdoing absolutely wasn't his fault. But as with literally everything involving Holmes, he just used this polished image to hide a much darker home life.
The reality of his 1861 upbringing in New Hampshire was reportedly quite different. Both of his parents were incredibly strict religious zealots. Locals and historical sources whispered about cruel discipline, including dark stories that his father would force the children to go without food for days, or even use rags dunked in kerosene to silence their crying. Whether he was seeking a respite from this troubled home life or simply wanting to be left alone, young Herman developed a habit of retreating deep into the woods.
And well, what exactly did he do in those woods? Holmes claimed that after bullies ambushed him and shoved him into a doctor's office with a human skeleton, he developed this intense fascination with anatomy. His woodland experiments escalated rapidly. He started out by dissecting small reptiles, then moved up to mammals like rabbits, and eventually, neighborhood dogs. He became entirely too comfortable with cutting up bodies, basically viewing them as mere fodder for his own dark ambitions.
Actually, the red flags just kept coming. When Holmes was only 11 years old, his best friend Tom tragically fell from the landing of an abandoned home they were exploring. Holmes claimed he merely saw Tom fall. But later in life, looking back at the absolute monster he became, many people questioned if this was truly an accident or potentially Holmes's very first kill.
Section 2. Med School Corpse Scams. As he grew up and headed to the University of Michigan, Holmes realized his gruesome childhood hobbies could actually be monetized. He wasn't just a killer, he was a hustler. During his medical studies, he pioneered a deeply cynical, step-by-step scam. He would steal bodies from the school's lab or even rob graves, mangle or burn them to render them unrecognizable, and then casually defraud life insurance companies by claiming they were accidental deaths. He even kept dead bodies in his room. His landlady once followed a foul stench, only to discover a dead infant under his bed, which he simply brushed off as homework. Unbelievable, right?
To fund his life and all these medical school schemes, Holmes frantically grifted wealthy women. He married Clara Lovering, took her money, and completely abandoned her. Then, while still legally married to Clara, he illegally married Myrta Belknap just to access her wealthy family's funds. Eventually, accumulating massive debts and fleeing his creditors in the dead of night from upstate New York, Herman Mudgett decided to completely reinvent himself. And so, in Chicago in 1886, H. Holmes was born. Section 3. The so-called murder castle. So, arriving in Chicago, Holmes bought a vacant lot that would eventually become his infamous stronghold. But that legendary Hotel of Death, Yeah, it was just a mixed-use retail building. The first floor was storefronts. The second floor was just long-term apartments. And that famous third floor he added in 1892, he told people it was going to be a hotel for the World's Fair, but it was literally never finished, never furnished, and never opened to the public. The entire hotel concept was simply a massive lie designed to swindle suppliers, investors, and insurers out of their cash. He was a liar long before he was ever considered a mastermind. Section 4. The real victims. We need to get serious here for a moment, because there were no random tourists falling through trapdoors. The roughly 9 people he actually did kill were business partners and lovers he already knew. Starting with his lover Julia Connor and her 8-year-old daughter Pearl, who just vanished on July 4, 1891, right after Holmes had taken out debts in Julia's name. This grim reality is best illustrated by his horrific betrayal of Ben Peitzel. In 1894, they concocted a scheme to fake Pitzel's death using a cadaver to split a $10,000 insurance payout, but Holmes double-crossed him. He murdered Pitzel for real using chloroform and benzene, stole the money, and then, if you can believe it, manipulated Pitzel's grieving widow into giving him custody of 3 of her children. Holmes later confessed to murdering 2 of those young children, burying their small bodies in the basement of a rental house. This wasn't a grand, theatrical villain. This was a cold-blooded, purely opportunistic monster. Section 5. Legacy of a Liar. Holmes was eventually caught and sentenced to hang in 1896, but of course, he had to execute one final con. Before his execution, he was paid an astronomical sum, $7,500, which was an absolute fortune back then, by the Hearst newspaper group for his written confessions. In these highly publicized documents, Holmes made wild, totally contradictory claims about his life, boasting that he had killed 27 people. The catch? Many of the people he named in his confession were easily proven to be still alive or to have died of natural causes. He was quite literally lying for a paycheck right up until his final breath. And in a final twist of deadpan irony, the man who spent his life stealing, mangling, and selling corpses for cash was utterly terrified of the exact same thing happening to him. No way was he taking any chances. He demanded his coffin be encased in solid cement and buried 10 feet underground to thwart grave robbers with the same dark proclivities that he had. So, where did that 200 body count come from in the first place? Well, historian Adam Selzer traced the entire 200 victims myth back to a single, completely unsubstantiated throwaway line in a book called Gem of the Prairie. It obliquely says that, quote, some people have suggested he killed 200 people. That's it. No evidence, just a rumor that everyone else blindly repeated, totally exaggerated, and sold for profit, keeping the myth of the murder castle alive for well over a century. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a truly fascinating mirror held up to our own culture. We have to ask ourselves, why is society so incredibly eager to buy into a good, gory legend, instead of facing the pathetic, greedy reality of a con artist? Holmes wasn't an evil genius of the World's Fair. He was just a violent grifter who preyed on the people closest to him. So the next time you hear a legendary true crime tale, ask yourself, are you actually learning the history, or are you just buying the con?